Right, so the BBC in trouble again over bias. Well, colour me surprised. That's any given day, surely. Certainly when it comes to establishment and government interests. But it's a rare thing for the corporation's own journalists to accuse the state-funded broadcaster they themselves work for of it, let alone 8 of them, let alone over the way they choose to cover the goings-on in Israel and Gaza right now. But this is where we are. The accusations made are that the BBC news agenda is putting too much effort into attempting to humanise Israeli forces over Palestinian ones. And when you consider how often you see Israeli spokespeople or Zionist settlers being interviewed and referred to, or referring to these people as being subhuman, or being animals, or behaving like animals, then these journalists do have a point. But is anything honestly going to change at the BBC over this? Right, so, the BBC. Easily one of the worst news outlets out there, in my opinion. If you're still relying on the BBC solely for your news, you probably think Jeremy Corbyn is still Labour leader and the Tories actually know what they're doing. But on the matter of the Israeli genocide taking place in Gaza, though, the state news service, as it basically is, made all the more annoying for those of us aware of that fact because we pay for it. The BBC has very much joined in on the "Do you condemn Hamas?" interview starter question bandwagon, and they have insulted guests they have interviewed, from the Palestinian ambassador Dr. Hussam Zomlot with that question amongst others, and practically had other guests reaching between bursting out laughing from the stupidity of the questioning to actually being angered by it. One such notable interview was on Newsnight between Kirsty Wark and United Nations Special Rapporteur for the Palestinian Occupied Territories, Francesca Albanese, who Wark was determined advocated for Palestine, when in fact her job is that she advocate for the upholding of international law in relation to Palestine. That's a pretty chronic gaffe, not even knowing the job of your own guest, but it went from bad to worse when Wark pressed Albanese on whether she thought Hamas cared 3,000 children had been killed in Gaza, and did she agree Hamas were breaking international law. Seems the BBC know even less about international law than Keir Starmer does. Albanese's face made her wonder what she'd done to deserve being interviewed by such an overpaid dumbarse, but who knows? Maybe Wark is one of these 8 BBC journalists who have now kicked off at their own corporation, their own bosses, over the narrative they as journalists, perhaps presenters, are having to push. I'd like to think Wark went home that night and examined her life choices, put it that way. At any rate, the 8 that have spoken out, anonymously, fearing reprisals, and not in any way convinced the 2,300-word letter they've drafted, which they are not sending to their bosses, because they figure there is absolutely no point in doing so. They just want people to know that there are people within the corporation who know the BBC is failing in its duty of impartiality on this matter. They are accusing the BBC of failing to tell the story of the Israel-Hamas conflict accurately, more interested in humanising Israeli victims over Gazan ones, as well as leaving out key historical context, which of course has also been quite blatant. To anyone watching the BBC who'd think this mess only began last month, not in 1948, possibly have never heard of the Nakba, with all the events in the intervening decades since. There is also a blatant double standard at work, since the BBC has no problem telling the events of the Russia-Ukraine conflict completely accurately, since in that case the government, and therefore the BBC, are pro-Ukraine. However, the reverse is true in the Middle East, and as such they are hypocritically pro-Israel. Instead, the journalist concerned sent the letter to a news outlet they knew would report it impartially and accurately, and depict the strength of their feelings on this as they wanted it. And as such, they sent it to AL-JAZEERA. Says a lot of our British media entirely, doesn't it? Now, I'm not going to go into the beings of the whole letter, 2,300 words after all, but there are standout excerpts from it that show the strength of feeling of disgust and despair on show. Across British Broadcasting Corporation BBC platforms, terms like massacre and atrocity have been reserved only for Hamas, framing the group as the only instigator and perpetrator of violence in the region. This is inaccurate, but aligns with the BBC's overall coverage. The Hamas assault, whilst appalling and devastating, does not justify the indiscriminate killing of thousands of Palestinian civilians, and the BBC cannot be seen to support or fail to interrogate the logic that it does. We are asking the BBC to better reflect and defer to the evidence-based findings of official and unbiased humanitarian organisations. Is that not disgusting, though? 2 of the 8 authors of this letter agreed to be interviewed by Al-JAZEERA over it, and one, a person of colour notably, said, "This organisation doesn't represent us. For me, and definitely for other people of colour, we can see blatantly that certain civilian lives are considered more worthy than others, that there is some sort of hierarchy at play. That is deeply, deeply hurtful because actually none of us struggle to empathise with Palestinian civilians. It appears some staff members and senior reporters don't empathise as much with Palestinians as they do, for example, with Ukrainian civilians. The second interviewee said that they were sickened by the senseless loss of civilian life during the Hamas attacks. I also felt a number of overlapping fears, including that the coverage of my employer, the BBC, would fail in its duty to sufficiently interrogate this Israeli response or provide adequate context on decades of occupation. My fears were immediately confirmed. They also spoke of the lack of compassion being shown and the uneven-handedness of interviews, singling out that so often used question that I brought up earlier, do you condemn Hamas? When interviewing pro-Palestine voices, and certainly the BBC were not alone in doing that. The Piers Morgan interview with Jeremy Corbyn was just ridiculous, but it's made all the more so now as it also shows Morgan is as bad as the BBC on this topic. They singled out the interview of Dr. Hussam Zomlot, that he did with Kirsty Wark, as this was on the 9th of October, after Dr. Zomlot had just lost several members of his own family. He told Wark of his emotional pain. He listed the relatives who had been killed, describing them as sitting ducks for the Israeli war machine. And Wark replied, I am sorry for your own personal loss. I mean, can I just be clear, though? You cannot condone the killing of civilians in Israel, can you? Nor the killing of families. Zomlot, taken aback, then said, no, we don't condone. No, we don't. I think we can safely assume at this point, though, that Kirsty Wark probably isn't one of the authors of this letter, can't we? Because that was absolutely shameless. That's like asking the victims of a murder if they feel sorry for the killer. Quite frankly, I couldn't care less what BBC editorial narrative might be in place if it means asking grieving people who have just lost family in an atrocity such as we've seen going on in Gaza a question like that. You tell the editors who are pushing that line to go and fuck themselves. It's not just the BBC journalists here and now who are critical of the BBC and its coverage, though. Many people have been for years now. My God, I could do a whole YouTube playlist just on the BBC myself. I've refused to treat them as a credible news source in and of themselves for years, since the 2019 general election, when, for a lot of people, their eyes were opened to the behaviour of the BBC, their conduct, and some of its reporters and presenters. But it is very much a topic of conversation across social media too. Just as I was writing this, a tweet caught my eye by a chap called Rob J, who said, the BBC literally just typing, Israel hits 300 targets as ceasefire is delayed, literally treating dozens of women and children blown up as targets and not even reporting on the mass murder anymore. Well, although the planned 4-day ceasefire hasn't begun yet, you can bet the BBC would never address Israeli victims by calling them as targets, would you? This is something that isn't going to go away. When even the staff working at the BBC, the journalists themselves, are kicking off to another media outlet, a foreign-based one at that, in order to be heard and tell their story of their despair and disgust, and saying on the record that there's no point in sending the letter to the BBC since nothing will change and nothing will be done about it. The BBC will continue to fail to inform people properly, fail to inform them impartially and even-handedly, and that isn't even just on this issue. It is on all news reporting that comes out of that corporation, full stop. British news outlets on the whole are awful. And the biggest takeaway from this is that if BBC journalists are going to Al-JAZEERA to make sure what they want to say is actually what gets told, you could do a lot worse than pay attention to that outlet yourself and what they report, especially on matters in the Middle East. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Please do have your say on this story in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where BBC coverage of all the Palestinian peace marches going on has been equally as skewed, seemingly more interested in what Suella Braverman has had to say on the marches than the point of the marches themselves, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.